The black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima swallowed footsteps like wet tar, absorbing sound, movement, and even the confidence of the men who walked across it. Japanese forces believed this island to be an impenetrable fortress, a perfect battleground sculpted by nature itself. Its slopes were steep, its tunnels endless, and its terrain unpredictable. For months, Japanese engineers had carved the island into a labyrinth of hidden positions, pillboxes, spider holes, and machine gun nests. They believed they understood every advantage the terrain offered. They believed they knew how to counter anything the Americans might attempt. And above all, they believed that the Marines would never master Iwo Jima's most treacherous feature, the sand. But they did. And they did it in a way the Japanese could not have imagined. It began with confusion. Japanese observers spotted Marines advancing across the beach, only to lose track of them seconds later. Men who were in plain sight suddenly vanished without smoke, without trenches, without digging. Entire fire teams disappeared between one glance and the next, swallowed by the black volcanic earth as if the island itself had turned traitor. At first, Japanese spotters assumed the Marines had simply fallen, tripped, stumbled, or taken cover behind dunes, but their field glasses revealed nothing. No movement, no silhouettes, no sand displaced by hurried digging. The Marines were simply gone. And then the gunfire began. The first bursts came from angles the Japanese had not expected, low to the ground, impossibly low, as if the Americans were shooting from inside the island's skin. Machine guns erupted from invisible positions, sending tracers slicing across open ground. Grenades arced out of nowhere. Riflemen popped up long enough to fire before disappearing once again. Japanese officers blinked in disbelief. They had mapped every crater and depression on the island. They knew every low point and ridge. They knew where American troops could hide and where they couldn't. Yet here the Marines were, firing from places that shouldn't exist. Japanese soldiers fired back, but their rounds passed over the Marines' heads, snapping uselessly through open air. The Americans were too low, too hidden, too protected. It made no sense. It defied everything the Japanese understood about ground combat. The truth was something few Japanese officers could accept. The Americans had learned how to build foxholes that vanished. Not camouflaged, not dug into trenches, but disappeared. The volcanic sand of Iwo Jima was unlike any battlefield soil the Marines had encountered before, fine as powder, black as soot, and heavier than anything they had trained in. A man could dig into it once and watch the walls collapse immediately, burying shovels, choking guns, and trapping soldiers in pits that folded inward like hungry mouths. Standard foxhole techniques were useless. But instead of abandoning the idea, one Marine engineer proposed something radical. Stop digging foxholes. Sink into them. He suggested a new technique, one that used the sand's treacherous nature against itself. By removing it in controlled scoops, shaping it with the weight of a man's body, and reinforcing the collapse rather than resisting it, Marines discovered they could create foxholes faster, deeper, and more invisible than any standard battlefield position. A Marine could disappear into the island in seconds. Japanese soldiers had no idea this was possible. They had built their entire defensive doctrine around the assumption that Marines would struggle to gain cover. They expected chaos on the beaches, heavy casualties, and obvious, shallow attempts at fortification. Instead, the Americans melted into the ground. As Japanese officers shouted counter-sniper orders and adjusted artillery, their men panicked. They fired into sand dunes where Marines had stood moments earlier. They strafed open ground with machine guns, hitting nothing but shifting black earth. They unleashed mortar rounds that landed harmlessly because the Marines had already vanished underground. One Japanese squad leader reported, "They attack, then disappear like shadows in the sand. Another said their bodies sink into the island. We shoot, but the bullets pass above ghosts. The phrase spread quickly, ghost Marines. But the phenomenon wasn't supernatural. It was engineering, American ingenuity applied to one of the harshest landscapes of the war. The disappearing foxhole method carried three key principles. First, Marines didn't dig vertically. They carved sideways and leaned their weight in to make the sand collapse gradually in a controlled funnel. Second, they reinforced the walls with helmets, packs, and boards carried for exactly this terrain. Third, they dug with the island, not against it, letting the sand bury edges and create natural camouflage. When finished, the foxholes looked like nothing at all. A slight depression, a disturbed patch of earth, a subtle fold in the landscape. And to Japanese snipers, it was invisible. From these holes, Marines could fire upward with minimal exposure. Their silhouettes were hidden, their heat signatures were low, their movement blended with the oscillating shadows created by the volcanic sand during bombardments. The Japanese tried to adapt. They adjusted their scopes, they changed firing angles, they lowered their machine guns, but every adjustment failed because the Marines refined their technique with each passing hour. As one Marine later wrote, "Iwo teaches you fast, you learn or you die." And the Marines learned faster than the Japanese imagined. Soon, entire squads moved like tides, rising from the sand, firing, then sinking back into safety. The Japanese began reporting that Marines were using tunnels, but intelligence officers dismissed the idea. No tunnels existed where Marines appeared. The terrain simply didn't allow it. The Japanese would later understand that the Americans had created something far more unsettling, a foxhole that appeared, vanished, and reappeared somewhere else minutes later. Even worse, the Marines used them offensively. A Japanese machine gun nest that believed it had pinned down a platoon suddenly found Marines rising out of the ground beside it. Bunkers designed to dominate open approaches suddenly had attackers emerging from angles that bypassed their firing arcs. Positions the Japanese believed secure were overrun by men who seemed to materialize from the sand itself. Word spread across the island rapidly. Soldiers whispered in their bunkers that the Americans were moving underground. Others muttered that the Marines were using camouflage nets that made them blend into the sand. Still others claimed the Americans had special gear that allowed them to burrow like animals. The rumors grew. Fear always expands when the truth is worse than the imagination. In truth, nothing supernatural or high-tech was happening. It was simply adaptation, humans learning a battlefield faster than their enemy. But on Iwo Jima, where the sand swallowed everything, the psychological impact of that adaptation was devastating. Japanese soldiers were trained to expect Marines charging forward in predictable lines. They were taught to exploit American exposure. They were prepared to fire into dense formations before the enemy dug in. Instead, the Marines advanced in waves that seemed to vanish on contact with the island. For Japanese gunners, it was like fighting enemies who dissolved into shadows. The first major Japanese counterassault failed for one reason. Their targets were never where they expected them to be. Machine guns aimed too high. Mortars landed behind where Marines once stood but no longer were. Artillery shells exploded above foxholes deep enough to absorb the shock, and Japanese riflemen found themselves firing at empty space while Marines popped up at their flanks. The Japanese commander of a frontline sector radioed headquarters in frustration, insisting the Marines were using concealed trenches built during the bombardment. His claim was dismissed. No trench network survived the naval bombardment. But the Marines didn't need trenches. They built each position in minutes. What terrified the Japanese wasn't the firepower, or the numbers, or even the relentless advance. It was the disappearance. Men who disappear become unpredictable. Unpredictable enemies break linear defenses. And on Iwo Jima, linear defenses were all the Japanese had. As the battle pushed inland, the Japanese attempted a night assault, believing darkness would negate the Marines' foxhole advantage. But darkness only made the disappearing effect worse. Marines sank into their positions, completely invisible in the shadows. Japanese soldiers, expecting to overrun exposed lines, instead charged into empty ground, only to be hit from below by rifles and machine guns emerging at the perfect moment. Some Japanese units broke entirely. Some refused to advance. Some hesitated long enough to lose the momentum required for a night attack. By dawn, Japanese officers realized they were fighting not only the Marines, they were fighting the island itself. And the Marines had mastered it. The Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima had always believed one thing with absolute certainty: American infantry could be tracked. Their movement patterns gave them away. Their positions grew noisy under stress. Their engineers worked in predictable lines. Their foxholes always appeared in clusters that could be mapped, triangulated, pinned down, and targeted with mortars. And when the Americans began digging anywhere on the island, the Japanese were usually the first to know. But on the fourth day of the fighting, that certainty vanished. Observation posts scattered across the volcanic ridges began reporting something that made no sense. American positions were disappearing. Not withdrawing, not evacuating, not falling back. Disappearing. Entire foxholes the Japanese had targeted hours before were suddenly gone. Teams of riflemen who had been watched carefully through periscope slits were no longer visible. Machine gun crews that had been fixed in place by coordinates simply weren't there anymore. At first, Japanese spotters believed the Americans were using smoke or dust to obscure movement. They scanned for dust clouds, checked wind direction, recalculated distances, but the terrain remained still, the ground remained dry, the wind carried nothing, and the foxholes remained empty. Japanese NCOs argued among themselves, trying to explain the impossible. Some claimed the Marines had dug tunnels overnight. Others insisted the enemy must be using trenches, but no trench lines appeared, no new earthworks, no fresh cuts in the ground. The volcanic soil around each vanished position remained completely undisturbed. By dawn, the confusion had turned into unease. When new American foxholes appeared in different places, right where the Japanese least expected them, the defenders felt their situational awareness unraveling. Their mental map of the battlefield no longer matched reality. And in a place like Iwo Jima, where every inch of ground was soaked in danger, losing that mental map was as deadly as losing ammunition. What none of the Japanese knew, and what no intelligence officer had been able to predict, was that the Marines had introduced a tactic so unusual, so adapted specifically to Iwo Jima's unique volcanic terrain, that it became a kind of battlefield illusion. A technique engineered not just for survival, but for psychological collapse. A technique the Marines simply called disappearing foxholes. The concept was brutally simple and totally unexpected. Marines dig shallow fighting pits, enter them, and then, without warning, vanish beneath the surface, not by moving, not by crawling away, but by collapsing a pre-weakened crust of volcanic ash into concealed sub-pits that had already been dug earlier. To Japanese observers, it looked like the Marines had melted into the earth. And once they were gone, new foxholes would erupt farther ahead, often during lulls or behind dust clouds created by naval gunfire. Japanese gunners would fire on the old positions, only to realize the Marines had already reappeared in new ones, closer, sharper, and impossible to predict. On the morning of the fifth day, the technique shattered the rhythm of the Japanese defense. A mortar team positioned inside a hardened cave bunker had been tracking a line of American rifle pits for nearly an hour, preparing to bracket them with perfect accuracy. They loaded their tubes, adjusted elevation, and waited for the correct wind shift. But when the Japanese commander peered through his tiny firing slit, the foxholes were gone, every one of them. He blinked, wiped the eyepiece, looked again. Nothing. Just empty grey ash. He called for his spotter. The spotter confirmed the same thing. The Marines had vanished, yet there was no movement in the field, no running, no crawling, no retreat. Not a single trace. He barked an order to hold fire until the positions were found again. But within minutes, Marines reappeared, this time 50 yards forward, in a line the Japanese didn't realize had even been dug. The mortar team fired immediately, but the rounds landed on the now empty old pits. The new pits were unharmed. The Japanese commander felt a cold dread sink into his chest. If the enemy could shift entire defensive lines without being seen, then every calculation he had trusted was useless. And then, as if mocking them, the Marines vanished again. The Japanese spotter shouted in frustration, sliding the periscope wildly across the terrain. He checked left, checked right, checked angles that no American should have reached, but the ground remained still. A few minutes later, the Marines surfaced once more, this time farther right. The commander slammed his fist against the bunker wall. He ordered infantry to reposition, only to realize the positions they were moving to cover were already irrelevant. Every defensive angle they had built over the last 72 hours was based on the idea that American foxholes remained fixed, but now the battlefield flowed like shifting sand. The Japanese infantrymen who advanced to counterattack felt the panic first. They sprinted toward what they believed was an exposed flank, but when they arrived at the position, the foxholes they had targeted were empty. The ground was churned, yes, but only in places where the Marines had already been. Before the Japanese could adjust, rifles crackled from their left, and the Marines emerged from entirely new directions. The Japanese attack dissolved instantly. Some troops froze. Some dove for cover. Others retreated toward the nearest cave entrance. None could understand what they had just witnessed. As the day wore on, the Marines used the same trick repeatedly. They would dig shallow foxholes, hold them just long enough to draw fire, then drop through the ash layer into deeper, hidden pits and crawl through short tunnels dug beneath the crust. When Japanese spotters saw the initial foxholes go silent, they called for mortars, but the shells hit empty holes. The Marines were already gone. A Japanese sniper hidden in a reinforced pillbox felt his confidence collapsing. He had lined up a perfect shot on a Marine kneeling in a shallow pit. He steadied his breath, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. But before he could fire, the Marine sank straight downward, like a man falling through the floor of a building. The sniper blinked, rubbed his eyes. The Marine was gone, no dust, no movement, just gone. Minutes later, the same Marine emerged 20 feet to the right and opened fire on a Japanese machine gun nest. The sniper panicked, firing wildly. He missed every shot. His breathing went ragged. His hands shook. He lowered his rifle, for the first time in the war genuinely questioning what he was fighting. The island, which once felt like a fortress, now felt haunted. On another ridge, a Japanese platoon moved to intercept what they believed was a static Marine line. But halfway across the open ground, the Marines vanished again, and the entire platoon halted in confusion. Their officer ordered them to drop to cover and wait for artillery. But when artillery landed, the Marines were no longer where the rounds fell. From deeper positions, the Marines rose, firing back with devastating effect. One Japanese soldier later recalled, "It was as if the Americans lived under the earth. They attacked, vanished, attacked again, vanished again. The ground belonged to them." Psychological cracks appeared everywhere. Runners began hesitating before delivering orders, afraid the Marines would appear beside them. Mortar teams began double-checking coordinates so obsessively that they delayed fire missions by minutes, an eternity in the chaos of Iwo Jima. Machine gun nests began wasting ammunition, firing at empty foxholes they believed still contained targets. On the sixth evening, during a lull in the fighting, two Japanese privates stared across the ash at the American lines. They whispered about what they'd seen. One insisted the Marines had dug tunnels everywhere. The other shook his head, saying the Americans were using tricks, illusions, maybe even underground explosives. Neither understood the simple truth. Marines were using Iwo Jima's own unstable volcanic ash against them. The ash crust formed naturally above deeper layers of softer earth. By weakening the crust in exact points, the Marines could collapse into hidden pits instantly. To Japanese eyes, the disappearance looked supernatural. And once the Japanese began fearing the ground itself, they began losing the ability to fight. The next morning, the Japanese launched what should have been a coordinated counterattack. Hundreds of soldiers surged from a network of tunnels and caves, determined to break through the Marine line. Their officers believed the Marines finally remained in fixed positions long enough to target accurately. But when they reached the ridge where the Marines were supposed to be, they found abandoned holes, some shallow, some collapsed, some containing only discarded ration tins and empty ammunition boxes. A few Marines had left boot prints leading away, but those too vanished into disturbed ash that revealed nothing. And then machine gun fire erupted from behind them. The Marines had shifted again, emerging from their hidden pits and advancing unseen. They cut through the counterattack with devastating precision. Japanese soldiers caught in the open ducked for cover only to discover the nearest pits were empty and useless. They had nothing but flat ash to protect them. The counterattack collapsed within 15 minutes. Survivors fled back to the tunnels, confused about what had gone wrong. Their officers shouted at them to return, but the men refused. They were not cowards. They were simply exhausted by illusions they couldn't fight. Word spread quickly through the tunnel networks. The Marines rise from the ground. They vanish into the soil. The earth itself shields them. In war, rumors spread faster than truth. And in Iwo Jima's claustrophobic darkness, rumors become reality. That night inside one command bunker, a Japanese captain studied the battlefield map with trembling hands. He circled the Marine positions marked earlier in the day. None of the circles were accurate anymore. Every time the Americans shifted foxholes, his map became obsolete. He threw the map aside. For the first time, he said quietly to his adjutant, "We are fighting an enemy we cannot locate." His adjutant nodded solemnly. "We cannot fight ghosts." Above them, the Marines prepared for the next phase of the battle. They strengthened their hidden pits, reinforced their tunnels, and continued perfecting the disappearing technique. Their movements were quiet. Their coordination was flawless. Their confidence grew with each successful deception. But for the Japanese defenders, the night was long and suffocating. Every noise outside the bunker walls sounded like digging. Every vibration felt like a foxhole collapsing. Every shadow across the ash field looked like Marines rising from beneath the earth. Sleep became impossible. Nerves frayed. Morale cracked. The psychological collapse had begun. But the worst effects of the disappearing foxholes were still yet to come. The deeper the Japanese forces pushed into the outskirts of the American beachhead, the more certain they became that the enemy was collapsing. Every time they advanced, they found another abandoned foxhole, another empty firing slit, another little depression in the ash that had held a Marine just minutes before. They didn't understand the pattern. They didn't see the hidden geometry beneath their feet. They only knew that something was wrong and that the Marines they expected to find were nowhere to be seen. But as the Japanese soldiers crept forward, the volcanic ground itself betrayed them. The smooth ash shifted under their boots, a small patch buckled, a metal grate disguised under a thin layer of dust gave way. One soldier tumbled into darkness before he could scream. Others jumped back, staring into a deep pit lined with corrugated steel and rock reinforcement. It wasn't natural, it was engineered. The Marines were not disappearing. They were waiting. Inside these concealed cells, American Marines sat pressed against volcanic walls, breathing quietly in the darkness. These weren't defensive foxholes at all. They were engineered vertical drops, disappearing foxholes, designed entirely to vanish the moment the Marines slipped below the surface. A man inside could see only narrow slits of light above his head. Light filtered through ash and camouflage netting so perfectly that even a careful observer standing a few feet away would not detect movement. As Japanese troops peered downward in confusion, the Marines did not fire. Not yet. They let the invaders get closer. Some Marines crouched within inches of the volcanic floor, rifles angled upward toward the disguised opening, listening to boots shuffle above their heads. When the Japanese forces realized how many of these pits existed, panic began spreading like smoke. The ground itself had become untrustworthy. Every step threatened to swallow them. Every shadow hinted at a hidden American. Every stride forward felt like a dare against the earth, a challenge to invisible traps waiting just beneath the surface. And it wasn't long before this psychological pressure began fracturing their unit cohesion. Then the first coordinated ambush began. A Marine rose silently inside his pit, pushed the camouflaged mesh aside, and opened fire upward and outward. His muzzle flash was barely visible from above, only a small flicker in the volcanic gloom, but his rounds tore through the Japanese formation instantly. Before the enemy could respond, dozens more Marines erupted from the earth like figures rising from grave. Some threw grenades. Others fired shotgun bursts or automatic rifle rounds in sweeping arcs. And then, before the Japanese could counterattack, the Marines dropped back into their pits, vanishing instantly beneath the ash. The Japanese soldiers returned fire, spraying the ground where the flashes had come from, but no Marines were visible. No heads, no silhouettes, nothing but smooth volcanic dust and hidden openings too subtle to see. As they advanced to inspect the area, the Marines rose again, this time from different foxholes, and cut the formation apart a second time. The Japanese officers shouted orders, but their words dissolved into chaos. Their men no longer knew where the Marines were shifting. They didn't know from which angle the next burst would come. They didn't know if the ground 5 feet ahead concealed another American squad. Every gap between rocks, every buried depression, every mound of ash felt like it hid a gun. A Japanese corporal described it later. It was as if the Marines were ghosts. They rose from the earth, they shot, and then the ground closed over them. By midday, the terrain was no longer a battlefield. It was a nightmare map. The Japanese forces began probing the ground with bayonets, stabbing down into the ash to test for hollow spots. Some soldiers crawled, afraid to step on anything that might collapse. Others abandoned their advance entirely, regrouping behind rocks while trying to decide what to do next. But the Marines had prepared for that too. A second network of disappearing positions sat much deeper, nearly 8 feet below the surface, connected by hand-dug tunnels. Marines crawled silently through these underground corridors, emerging from foxholes far behind the Japanese lines. One squad popped up behind a boulder and eliminated an entire forward observation group before slipping underground again. Another squad surfaced dozens of yards from its original position, firing long bursts that sowed confusion and forced Japanese forces to fire at empty ground. Every minute the ambush continued, the Japanese soldiers grew more certain they were fighting an enemy capable of being anywhere. They had fought stealthy opponents before. They had faced American night raids. They had endured artillery barrages and machine gun nests, but nothing compared to enemies that rose and fell with the earth itself, enemies that vanished between the beats of a heartbeat. Officers attempted to regroup near a rocky ridge, but the ridge itself held 3 hidden foxholes beneath its shadow. The Marines inside listened as Japanese boots approached. They waited, rifles raised but silent. Then, as the Japanese formed a tight command cluster, 2 Marines emerged and dropped grenades at the group's center. The explosions tore through their formation like lightning. As surviving soldiers scrambled backward, a 3rd Marine surfaced from a foxhole behind them, creating the impression that the Americans had been surrounding them all along. The Japanese forces broke from the ridge, their retreat disorganized, their morale shaking. Some soldiers began using their rifle butts to smash the ground, trying to collapse any hidden pits. Others threw grenades into random patches of ash, hoping to catch Marines inside. But these were guesses, blind, desperate guesses. And every time a Marine emerged from a foxhole untouched, it convinced the Japanese forces even more deeply that they were facing something supernatural, something that defied their understanding of warfare. The Marines were not using magic. They were using engineering, discipline, and an intimate understanding of Iwo Jima's terrain. Their disappearing foxholes were not simply pits. They were fully integrated ambush systems. Each one was placed deliberately along likely Japanese advance pathways. Each one had a pre-selected kill angle. Each one had a camouflage cover designed to blend seamlessly with volcanic ash. And each one had an exit tunnel that allowed Marines to relocate before the enemy could respond. By late afternoon, the Japanese forces had collapsed into a defensive crouch. They no longer advanced. They no longer probed confidently. Every footstep felt like a risk. Every shadow seemed alive. Every gust of wind kicking ash into the air made soldiers flinch, expecting Marines to rise with it. A sergeant ordered his squad to regroup beside a shallow depression, unaware that it was another disguised Marine tunnel entrance. As they knelt, knives and rifles ready, the earth beside them shifted. A Marine's head appeared almost silently. Before the Japanese could react, his squad burst from the ground and swept the depression clean with automatic fire. They disappeared again before reinforcements could arrive. That moment broke the last thread of Japanese discipline. Positions that had held firm for hours began falling back. Some soldiers ran instinctively toward higher ground. Others climbed over rocks without caring whether Marines might be behind them. Officers attempted to shout orders, but their voices carried no authority anymore. Men simply did not trust the battlefield beneath them. Marine commanders watched through binoculars as the psychological damage rippled through Japanese ranks. They had seen units panic before, but never like this. The disappearing foxholes weren't just killing soldiers, they were erasing the Japanese sense of control. Each ambush rewrote the battlefield rules. Each hidden position stole a little more confidence. Each disappearing Marine left an impression that the Americans could turn the terrain itself into a weapon. As evening approached, American forces initiated the final movement of the ambush. A coordinated wave of Marines surfaced from dozens of foxholes simultaneously, forming an unbroken firing line where Japanese forces believed the ground was empty. Machine guns, rifles, and grenades unleashed a devastating barrage that shattered the remaining Japanese cohesion. Some Japanese soldiers dropped their weapons entirely, staring wide-eyed at Marines rising out of the earth in perfect formation. Others attempted to charge and were cut down instantly. A few tried to fall back into defensive positions, but those positions had already been compromised by earlier ambushes. Within minutes, the entire Japanese assault wing crumbled. By nightfall, the battlefield was eerily quiet. The Marines climbed out of their foxholes, some wiping ash from their eyes, others stretching their arms after hours spent underground. They moved through the terrain with calm confidence, their lines reforming in the open air. Meanwhile, the Japanese forces that remained retreated into deeper volcanic tunnels, too shaken to attempt another advance. In the days that followed, Japanese intelligence officers interviewed survivors of the assault. Their reports revealed something striking. Nearly every soldier described the Marines the same way as spirits, ghosts, phantoms rising from the earth. One Japanese officer summarized the collapse in a single sentence. "We did not lose to their bullets, we lost to their vanishing." What the Japanese forces experienced on Iwo Jima was more than a tactical defeat. It was a psychological breaking point. The disappearing foxholes had transformed the battlefield into an unpredictable maze, one where American Marines held every angle, every shadow, every pocket of earth that might hide a man. And long after the guns fell silent, Japanese survivors remembered one terrible truth. It wasn't the firepower that defeated them. It was the ground itself, shaped by Marines into a weapon unlike anything they had ever faced.